articulations here. So let me walk you through scenario number 1. The Mareña Renovables wind park would have been the largest wind park in all of Latin America. It would have generated almost 400 megawatts of electricity, enough to power more than 600,000 Mexican homes. With the Isthmus wind as its resource, the 132 turbines and their generators would have prevented almost 900,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions every year for at least 2, perhaps 3 decades. Financed by a consortium of international investment programs, the Mareña Park would have put millions of dollars into the hands of environmentally conscious investors, providing capital for sustainable infrastructure projects in the future. The companies that would have purchased the clean power from the park would have benefited from receiving bonos de carbono, or carbon credits, offsetting their carbon footprint and burnishing their profiles as socially responsible corporate enterprises. In the Isthmus, jobs would have multiplied during the construction phase, giving work to unionized laborers from across southern Mexico. And once built, the project would have provided jobs in engineering, maintenance, and management. Indigenous communal landholder, Icots and Biniza people would have collected millions of pesos for the lease of their land. These funds, in the hands of farmer and fisher folk, would have been invested in better homes, equipment, and education. More things would have been bought, people would have been healthier and happier, and development would at last have arrived in the more remote regions of the Isthmus. Would have been paved, streetlights would have appeared, politicians and agencies of government would have been pleased. Mexico would have stood prouder, leading countries of the global south toward greener futures. But this, I would argue, would have been a failure. Let me take you to scenario number 2. The Mareña Renovables wind park would have been the largest wind park in all of Latin America. It would have occupied 73 acres of territory, its ivory turbines arcing across a sliver of land between the Laguna Superior and the Laguna Inferior. The territory where it would have been erected, a narrow sandbar, is only a sandy stretch of land that would have been asked to support 132 turbines, each one reaching 32 stories into the sky and weighing 285 tons. The towers of steel, many tons of cement, and 396 blades churning the air might have created quakes in the sand, sending tremors across the lagoons. Lights atop the turbines would have burned day and night, and fish and shrimp and other seaborne life might have retreated and migrated, leaving local fisherfolk without their daily catch. The fish might never have returned, and local communities might never have fished again. Construction work would have displaced many tons of mud and earth, and the docking stations where steel and concrete would have been offloaded would be forever changed. Jobs constructing the park would have gone to outsiders, not to residents of the region. For the lease of their land, some would have become richer, while others would not. Frictions would have endured. Landholders would have indentured their lands for decades. Automatic renewals on lease contracts would have come to feel very much like dispossession or despojo, being robbed of one's land. Indigenous and campesinos' lands would appear once again to be vulnerable to the whims of the transnationals, and members of communal estates and communal landholders would feel that they had never been informed about the gargantuan size and impact of the park. Wind power would cause strife and pitched battles between neighbors and within families across the Isthmus, and in the communities where the massive wind park would have been located, protests, blockades, vehicle heists, and raids by state police would carry on for years. Those who vocally spoke out against the works of the project would receive death threats and beatings. But with perseverance and strategies learned over decades of political unrest, protesters would ultimately stop the park's construction. It would be arrested and incapacitated, and this too would be a success. So there are many reasons for the thwarting of the Mareña Renovables wind park, and these are just 2 scenarios of the imagined possibilities it offered and those limits that it faced. Local communities found themselves at odds with the corporation and with the contractors who were trying to build the park and creating the materials for construction. And here you see they've taken a contractor's truck and overturned it. You can see the bed of the truck here in the background as a kind of resistance to allowing the company to go forward. One of the ways in which people spoke about the potential of the park and the problem with wind development in the Isthmus more generally was the way that corporate interests had carved up the Isthmus into zones of corporate control, meaning that one could only lease their land to these particular corporations. And many people describe this as dividing up the isthmus into rabanas de pastel, or pieces of cake to be divided amongst the corporate actors. There was also much discussion about what you see here is la nueva conquista, or the new conquest of wind parks and wind power overtaking the isthmus region, which has now become the densest concentration of wind power parks anywhere on the planet, anywhere on land. So we see reactions against this dispossession, and we see these Spanish galleons represented too, with wind turbines on their sails, and a conquistador with, of course, a wind turbine in place of a staff or a sword, as a threat to the isthmus region that's recognized by local communities. Because while the lease of land had been beneficial for those in the isthmus who owned good windy land, if you were a landowner and had strong winds that a company wanted to contract, you could have wonderful things like a new home, newly painted, new stories to your home. But this was in juxtaposition to others who lived in more humble conditions. And so the disparity of wealth between those who had good windy land that they could lease and those that did not only exacerbated the inequalities that already existed in this part of Mexico, in one of the poorest states in the entire country. So responses to the building of the parks was widespread. Reaction and resistance, again, built over many decades of concern. And in caravans to Mexico City, for example, and you see these two protesters who had come from the isthmus to protest in Mexico City, they brought their fight and their challenge all the way to the center of the Mexican state to demand changes to the financing structure and non-collective qualities of these wind parks that were privately owned and managed largely by Spanish corporations, which again lends to this notion of la nueva conquista, when many of the corporations are Spanish corporations running the wind parks in this region. But all of this protest, and here you see the town of Juchitán, a big protest that happened in the streets, written in Pinisa and in Spanish, reactions to the park. All of these human concerns about displacement and despojo and the politics of land and the politics of wealth and value, in many ways, protest against the park and its final dénouement, its final destruction of its ability to be built, all came down to this. It all came down to what many people described as the wealth of our sea. So I like to think through what it might mean for a wind park to be thwarted by the wealth of our sea, to be thwarted by fish. It seems a kind of impossibility, and yet in this context, that is precisely what happened. If we look at these human entanglements with environments and energy, we are able to see a more complex picture of how human interests and human desires be wrapped up into these elemental forces like wind and into the politics of food and subsistence. You see a mural here in La Ventosa where this young man is sort of trying to get some kind of sustenance from this dried stalk of corn that's no longer giving it any life. And this belief that the wind parks themselves were drying out the land and destroying it such that it would be difficult to farm. Okay, and here I think I need to bring up this second one, sorry. So when we see these entanglements, we want to look deeper into the kind of complexities of the politics of the construction of wind parks and their entanglement with human and other than human beings. Now, to build a wind park, you need to get permission from the Electricity Commission and from the Regulatory Commission, the Federal Regulatory Commission. But you also need to acquire permission from SEMARNAT, which is the Secretary of Energy and Natural Resources. And in a conversation that I was able to have with Alberto, which is a pseudonym, who's the Director of Evaluation for the Energy and Industrial Sectors, SEMARNAT, he was very clear about the challenges of creating industrial infrastructures in ecologically precarious places. And he said vigilance is very important because sometimes the local impact of a project, like a wind park, is much more environmentally detrimental than climate change is. And here he really gets at the core of the question, where it becomes a trade-off, if you will. And Isabelle Stengers, the philosopher, has a very good way of thinking about this when she asks about for whose greater good are we undertaking these projects of renewable energy transition, of species preservation, and all of the other things that get entangled in the Anthropocene and questions of climate change and climate destruction. So if we think about the balance between local environments and a global need to reduce the number of greenhouse gas emissions that are created through the production of electricity, for example, then we start to see some of the challenge and some of the rift between the local and global environmental impulses and needs for protection. And people like Alberto and people who work in that space have a deep understanding and awareness of that trade-off and sometimes that conflict that occurs between those two competing factors. In order to build a wind park in Mexico, you also need to have a manifestación ambiental, which is an environmental impact assessment. And in that impact assessment, many different creatures and plant life is taken into consideration. So one of the creatures that was marked as requiring attention was the TEHUANA hare, the TEHUANTEPEC jackrabbit, which is an endangered species. There's only 1,000 of them left in the world, and their breeding territory and their habitat is endangered and separated. And one of the locations where the wind park was to be put was precisely the home of this endangered hare, which received attention in the environmental impact report. Also receiving attention were important raptor species like the sharp-shinned hawk, important that live in the region. And when they spent time researching the region where the wind was to be built, found 82 different species of birds, water birds and non-waterfowl that either passed through this region in migration to the south or back north during the winter or the summer, or nested in this region or lived their entire lives there. And so I wanted to include here just some of the birds that would be affected by the wind park had it been put into this particular space. Also in this region is a little humble creature known as the lesser long-nosed bat, which interestingly enough never made it into an environmental impact assessment. And Bettina, who I know you heard from, I think a couple of weeks ago, who's also been a longtime activist in the Isthmus and with whom we spent a lot of time, she was someone who really pointed out to me the importance of this humble creature, what kind of work they do for evacuating insects from the region, and the importance of their habitat. And she also recognized that these are the lesser known and lesser recognized creatures that get bowled over sometimes in these projects of development where they're unrecognized. So I wanted to come back to this question of fish and the ways that animals and plant life get pulled into these stories of development that seem to have such a human interest at their core, and wonder out loud how it is that we can in a more fulsome way, more fully pull in the kinds of other species that we cohabitate with, but that we also need to continue to have peace with as we go forward in trying to remediate global climate change in these really grand scales that we now see in the condition of the Anthropocene. And so the humbleness of fish, I think, is a way into that thinking and a way into imagining different and better ways forward. Why fish? I mean, many people would say, what does a wind turbine have to do with fish? I think if you look at the placement of these turbines, where they would have been, the 102 that go across the Barra itself, and then the other 30 that are down here in Santa Maria del Mar, you can see that the park was being placed in a very interesting, unique geographic location that was right upon the lagoon and right next to the sea. And so this is where local fisher folk would put out their boats. And when local fisherfolk realized that the barra, as you can see it again here, was now to become privatized, that people might not be able to put their boats in the water any longer, that they might not be able to access the fishing grounds that they have fished for many hundreds of years, that would become a real concern and could become a problem of subsistence. Because while the majority of people in the isthmus do not rely upon fish for their quotidian livelihood, it is a kind of backup subsistence food. If there's no work or if you're in a particular place of need, being able to go fishing is an incredible resource. And there are also many fisher folk in the region who do depend on that as their livelihood. And so the question of fish and shrimp and their ability to cohabitate, if you will, with this wind park became a real point of concern and option. Also atop these wind turbines are lights, and there's a sound that's made by the rotor blades turning, the destruction that would happen during the construction phase. All of these things came into play as the argument was made by activists to agencies like SEMARNAT that this wind park was actually environmentally destructive rather than an environmental salvation or environmental remediation to global climatological harm. The thing is that it's actually both, right? It has this potential of destruction locally. It also has the great potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Mexico. And so these environmental concerns become conflicted and yet coterminous in many ways. And hence these two scenarios of the success and the failure, because I see it as both and. So I wanted to bring into your attention this context of the Anthropocene and the precarious tension between local impacts and global concerns and global needs for climate remediation. And the Anthropocene is a designation of an epoch that's been proposed by many scientists, geologists, to mark a particular time that's a movement away from the Holocene, the time when we humans grew up and learned our civilizations. This Anthropocene age is a new epoch where the dominant agent of change is humanity itself, making its imprint everywhere in the world and across all Earth systems. So in basic terms, it captures this human influence upon every system everywhere on the planet, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the cryosphere, and the biosphere. So it's a pervasive and all-encompassing condition, the Anthropocene, and one that we need to all be attentive to, although of course some of us in the past and in the present are more responsible for the impacts and effects of the Anthropocene age than others, and certainly there are some of us who will be much more badly affected by the Anthropocene effects and conditions that come with global warming. One of the questions that's been important for geologists in trying to confirm the condition of the Anthropocene and to come to an agreement that it is in fact our current epoch is when to begin the dating of the Anthropocene. When did it begin, essentially? And so there are some arguments that say that it began about 12,000 years ago with the advent of agriculture, when we had gatherers and hunters change their form, began to till and began to toil in the soil, moving away from hunting and gathering and becoming agricultural subjects. And there are those who mark the beginning of the Anthropocene with the expansion of European colonialism, where you had much larger numbers of Europeans moving from Europe over to the Americas and other places in the New World, and also bringing from Africa many enslaved people. And in this transportation of people all over the planet, along came animals and plants and other biotic materials too, utterly transforming the shape of the planet in terms of what existed where and who would live and who would thrive and who would die in these spaces. There are also those who argue that the Anthropocene began around 1775 when James Watt invented the steam engine that drove the engines of the Industrial Revolution in Europe that then spread elsewhere. This one machine was really the beginning of this Anthropocene age. And then there are those who mark the 1950s, the middle 20th century, and a time that they call the Great Acceleration as beginning the Anthropocene, where you had the expansion of the use of private vehicles, for example, and much more dramatic increases in greenhouse gas emissions as larger industrialization processes occurred. So these are some of the debates about when the Anthropocene might have begun. I'd also like to add one more, and that is to say that I can see it as having begun in the wind. The wind that blew the Spanish galleons to the New World, the wind that blew the ships that held enslaved people from Africa and brought them to the Americas, the wind that blew trading ships across the Atlantic and around the world and transplanted people and things and materials in ways that we had not seen before. So I bring the wind into the Anthropocene to see the ways in which its energetic force, as a force of nature, has actually shaped human conditions and the politics of the present, not only because it is now seen as a salvational potential in the form of wind parks that might reduce our Anthropocene condition, that might reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, but also to say that the wind was there at the source. It was part of the origin story of the condition in which we now find ourselves. So wind was there when the Anthropocene began, in my reading, and it also offers up a salvational potential to undo this Anthropocene condition incrementally if we're able to take the right steps to make a renewable energy into a more egalitarian project that has been the case thus far. And the hope is that there is a future for wind that doesn't ignore its past, but that also can bring us or blow us into a benevolent future where we can enjoy the fruits of energy without the destruction of local environments and without the appropriation of indigenous and campesino lands. So thank you.
So thank you very much, Cymene. This was an amazing lecture. I really loved the ending, and I was thinking as we were listening to your lecture about the dialogue between your project and a project of Dominique Boyer, and lots of questions came to my mind. I want to give a priority to the questions from the public. If there are any questions, please type them in the and I'm going to read them to Cymene.
Kata, can you tell me how to get out of this screen share so that I can see in a more normal way?
I think you have to just press stop sharing. That should be on the top.
Oh, there we go. Yeah,
that's better. We are done. Yes.
Okay, good.
So while people are thinking about their questions, I think that at certain point when you're showing the dry earth and the claims of local people that this wind energy, is really drying the ground, is really destroying their fishing. I noticed that you were saying, according to them, it is happening. Has there been any effort to check if the wind energy is really causing these problems, or is it, according to some yes, according to some not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question. There is no evidence that that the wind turbines are actually drying out the land, but it is a kind of a belief among some people in the region that it's actually creating desertification in the region. And the logic behind that is that the turbines are being imagined in this case as operating like a fan, like a regular fan you would have in your living room, maybe, that dries out the air or dries out the land. But there's no evidence to show that it's doing that. I think the fact that there is a belief system around it, though, is very interesting. The fact that people worry about the effects of these industrial developments in agricultural lands is very important and very resonant. Another story that we heard from quite a few people, or question really, was, are these turbines causing cancer? because there was a lot of concern about that, because the turbines around the town of La Ventosa, for example, that town is completely surrounded by wind turbines, and they're in very close proximity to people's homes. So there's real concern about the effects. I mean, we know from research here in the United States that wind turbines can cause kind of anxiety disorders and other health disorders, kind of autoimmune disorders. There's been some linkages with that. Nothing that we've seen in Mexico, but it's kind of an open question, and that's a biomedical question more than anything. But for me, from the point of view of an anthropologist, the fact that there are sort of belief systems around these changes is really indicative of the anxieties of transition, right? What does it mean to have land that's been designated as agricultural for centuries and centuries, and to have communal landholders and indigenous people who farm that land, and then now it very rapidly becomes industrialized, because now the land in the isthmus that is made into wind parks is categorized as industrial land. So it's really is, I mean, talk about ontological transformations. It really is an ontological transformation of this place. And so the concerns that people have are real, even if we don't yet have evidence of there being, sort of direct impacts like drying out the land or causing cancer.
So probably some research should be done on these issues, and future projects should take into consideration some maybe zones of distancing these parks from human populations. And this is all very interesting and very new to most of us. So we have some questions. I have one more myself, but I'll leave it for the end. I think Jim has a hand in the air. Jim, are you able to speak? Jim, are you able to speak? I don't think so. So maybe we'll ask Jim to type his question in the chat, and I'm going to read Alison's question. Are there any Mexican wind development companies that are developing wind farms in more community integrated ways?
Well, there was one company that was working in the isthmus called Demex, and they sort of disintegrated in a few different ways and came back together in other ways. It's such an interesting question, because the question about who is developing in the isthmus is really very opaque in many ways. So you have these multidimensional factors. So you have the land in which the turbines are sited. You have the financing that goes into the development of wind parks, which is often international in origin. And then you have companies and contractors and others who are building out the actual infrastructure. So the question of like whether a company is Mexican or not becomes really interesting and complicated in that way. So you might have contractors who are working with Mexican companies exclusively, but perhaps the company itself is owned by a Spanish corporation, or it's financed by finance capital from the United States. So it's a tricky kind of entity in a way, who owns and who builds these things, because there's so many different inputs into creating these megaproyectos, right? These massive structures that require so many different inputs. And one of the issues that we saw as we were doing the research was really that there was a lot of obscurity around this. So people would sort of know the name of one company, but they weren't quite sure. And the park is going up over in this part of the isthmus, but we're not quite sure who's financing it. And the banks of themselves were very, very quiet about where their money would flow into the isthmus. We had a great conversation with someone who was very high up in finance capital in a large development bank that I'll leave unnamed. We don't name him at all in any of our writings. We call him the banker. And he gave us a lot of really interesting insights into the financing of these parks. But he also was very clear that they keep their financial ties very untransparent, because they don't want the bank's name being used in these protests in the isthmus. So it's a very volatile space. The development, the financing, the construction, and who owns what piece of it and when.
Thank you, Cymene.
Can you hear my voice now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I have to laugh when you talk about the windmills drying out the land as if it were a fan blowing air over it. A fan, you put the power in, the fan generates the wind that blows across the land. This situation is the exact reverse. The wind is already there. the turbines are not causing it. I think people, somewhere along the line, people are getting conned here. They're thinking it's getting totally reversed. And also on the fishing, you say, well, it doesn't hurt the fish, but the fishermen can't launch their boats off the shore. But these are boats. You could launch them somewhere else and move them down there. The objections that are being they're voicing here don't make any sense at all. And I mean, maybe some of the economic things would fit in, but the idea that the fish out in the ocean are going to be disrupted by the wind before it gets to the turbines, or that the turbines are causing the air to dry out. This is just craziness. But I know everybody, when we say solar, they think of generating electricity, right? And then what do you do? How do you heat the water in your house? Well, they probably heat the water with electricity, right? I mean, how do the people in Mexico or in that part of Mexico or anywhere in Mexico, how do they have hot water? Well, if they heat it by electricity, what sense does it make to use the wind to generate electricity, or use the sun or wind or whatever, that's solar, to generate electricity, when you could just generate it directly by the sun? Now, the rest start off as going to be solar. And I know in places where there's lots of sun, Israel, for example, people have solar heaters on their roof. They heat their domestic hot water with the sun, and then you don't have the day-night problem so much, because you heat it during the day, but you have insulation in your heater and it lasts all night. If you needed to supplement it because you have a lot of cloudy weather or something, you could use electricity. But most of the energy that is being absorbed and utilized, if you live in a climate where it doesn't freeze. Now in Wisconsin, this is not going to work, but if you live in a climate where it doesn't freeze, the most practical use of the sun is to heat water, rather than to generate electricity, which they then send around and then come bring back to use to heat your water. And one last thing about the wind, if you're familiar with the island of Aruba, the trees on Aruba are all bent the same way. You see these classic pictures of the Caribbean islands, and Aruba is a good example. The trees are bent a certain way. Why are the trees bent that way? It's because the wind is constantly flowing in the same direction as the tree is growing, and it's consistent enough and strong enough to cause the trees to bend. Now, if that is the kind of wind you have, you can and also electricity in Aruba is pretty expensive because they get it from oil. And even though they're very close to Venezuela, which has a lot of oil, nevertheless, the electricity is expensive. The wind is strong enough to bend the trees, and I don't understand why nobody has said about putting this row of windmills they're talking about. And the other thing about the island, the wind always comes in from the east, and there's no tourist attractions on the east. The seas there are kind of stormy. All the big hotels with the tourists are on the west side, the leeward side. So you have offshore winds there. So building these big turbines is not going to interfere with the tourism, a bit. And if you want in places like that, if you want the storage, you don't necessarily have to have big batteries, because there's bluffs on the east side. If you have extra electric power, you can use it to pump water up into reservoirs along the shoreline, and then if the winds die off, or maybe it may be seasonal, then you can drain the reservoirs to generate electricity. So there's ways that you can equalize the flow of irregularities in the solar or wind power. And it sounds to me like there's a lot of opportunity. If the winds are that strong, as you say, almost virtually hurricane force, there's got to be a way to make efficient use of that.
Yeah.
I don't know. It sounds like the whole objections are political, not technical.
Yeah, except that it was interesting when people asked for similar cases, they couldn't find another wind park anywhere on the planet that was built on a sandbar. I mean, you saw it's a very fascinating kind of geological space in that sense. This very narrow sandbar, which is fairly shallow and then surrounded by all these waters. So, when people who were reacting to the development of this particular park the response was like, show us some environmental impact reports or, the outcome of these parks that are in a similar situated place. And of course, you can't find one because it's a very unusual sighting right there on the water on the sandbars. So there were some sort of scientific technical questions too. One of the other things that people spoke about quite a bit was the worry about what they call cut and paste environmental impact reports. And we heard this many, many times from people who said, like, yeah, sure, you've got your environmental impact report, but how do we know that it's legitimate? Because as we understand it, these things get cut and pasted and they take a little bit of this intelligence and a little bit of that research and then kind of remix it and replay it into something that they then call the MIA. Now, that's a product and a concern about corruption and the efficiency of state agencies, right? So that hits a whole different political register. But it is a real concern when the population does not have faith in the government institutions that are arbitrating whether this is an environmentally sound project or not. And I think that, the other thing about fishing is that, yes, you can get in a boat and move down the shore, but some of these other shores are already private property. And when you're talking about asking people to go a mile or two out of, further than they normally would and have for the last several hundred years, you're talking about a lot more investment in diesel because they do use motor boats, right? So you're having to buy that gas, and then you have to motor out, and it takes you an hour to get to the fishing spot. And then I think the other question was, like, where are the fish going to go if they abandon this? If they abandon the waters, will we be able to find them, essentially? So these were they were untested or speculative, but they were real concerns. And that's how you get the dissolution of a wind park because of fish. And I think it's a good lesson for us to think through the kinds of human and non-human entanglements, to think through the real complexities of environmental impact, because it's much more complex than doing one study and say, like, oh, well, it should apply here because it might have applied there. It gets complicated and it's very locally situated and sited. So as we do these transitions to renewable energy forms, I think we need to really take these into account, the complexity of local conditions, political and ecological.
So we do have one more question, which is a different kind of question, but very interesting, dealing with the conceptual framework. Logan is writing, saying, thank you for the great talk. We actually have a lot of thanks for great talk here on the screen. And he says, I was wondering if you have any take on Helen Verran's conceptualization of ontics, which Anna Singh has described as practices in which modes of being are enacted versus ontologies, which are necessary human and philosophical. In what ways might these different entry points modify your work on the more than human aspect of this project?
That's great. I mean, I love Helen Verran's work, and the idea of the ontic, I think, fits very nicely into the kind of ontological capacities of wind as a relational encounter. So if we imagine it in a more adjective form, an interactive form, what I call a relational form, how wind interacts with and upon bodies and persons and subjectivities and spaces, upon water and land, then we come to a point where we can actually see this as a more ontic form of engagement. And I think one of the things that Anna's tried to do, and certainly Anna Singh, is to move away from maybe the older Heideggerian version of ontology as limited in a corporeal form, and one that does not allow for the kind of phenomenological interactions and engagements. So in some sense, I can see both operating. We can take wind as an ontological or an ontic form of encounter and engagement, and also see it in its more traditional ontological capacities as force, as power that can be captured through these kinetic forms. And Anna Singh stuff, I really love her work. I engage with it all the time, and in my book, she's written in there throughout. And she actually came out for a a kind of a workshop when I was working on the book, and she read the species chapter, which was a challenging chapter to write, but really gratifying in a lot of ways. And so it was neat to get to speak with her about kind of, we were talking about like, how do you do an ethnography, or how do you interview and do an ethnography of birds? Like, how do you really do posthumanism? How do you do multi-species ethnography? What sorts of resources can you call upon? So in an ethnography of bird life, it may be talking to ornithologists. That's kind of an obvious STS direction to go, but also spending time in those spaces with birds would be a way of doing not exactly an interview, but some kind of encounter, some kind of methodological engagement with non-humans. And I think we can say the same for wind. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to try and generate some feeling of the wind, some affective engagement with the wind, is that being in it, it shapes you, it conditions you in a way that you might not have been conditioned before. And among the people of the isthmus who've grown up in this wind that knocks over trucks, this is a wind that blows the dirt in your face. It throws rocks into your eyes. It's a very intense environmental force to live with. And so, what do we do with these forces, and how do they reshape us? So, yeah, I think both of these scholars that you're mentioning are right in the same vein with what I'm trying to do here too. So that's a great question. Thank you for it.
So I was just, when you were answering this question, missing the possibility of being in the space with the strong wind and closeness of the ocean, even if it throws stones into our faces. I think we are all in need of some space here. We are running out of time, but I have just a question out of curiosity, because we heard Dominique's Boyer lecture and now yours. Did you guys have the same take on this project, or did you have differences in the way you viewed the questions of technology, the demands and resistance of the local population? How was the dialogue between the two of you? I imagine there must have been some differences. It would be strange because you are two different people.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we did the research collaboratively. We did the interviews, we did the participant observation, we did all of the research collaboratively and in conversation with one another. And then as we got about maybe a third or halfway through the research, we realized that we wanted to focus in on different areas of contestation. And so he stuck with the kind of the political economy, historical take on the conflict. And I turned more to the environmental conflict, the ecological questions that informed the conflicts as well. And they're both operating at the same time. And you could gather them all together into one analytic, but we felt it would be more productive to be able to break apart those readings, those interpretations of what was occurring. So on the one hand, when I read his book, I agree with it 100%. And when he reads mine, I think he agrees 100% too. So it's this paradox of they're both the right answer, if you will, to the question and the problem of renewable energy. It's just taking them and observing them from different points of view. And the other thing about being able to take these different analytics is that we're able to use different theoretical materials and devices. So he developed this idea of energo power, which is drawing from Foucault and sort of biopower. And I was much more interested in highlighting ecofeminist work and looking at more than human feminist interpretations of these kinds of transitions. So it allowed us both to do our own thing theoretically, which is important, and to kind of create our own portrait and picture of what is occurring in the isthmus, not to sort of delete or dismiss the other, but to enhance it and make it more robust and full. And I think that we did that. So it was an experiment, to be sure. We called it the duograph, and it's definitely an experimental form. And we do have them available. We have them as free downloads. And so if you can, can you open up the chat box? Because I could put it in the chat box here.
I think it's open. Or you
Okay.
can, yeah.
Where do I go there?
If you go to that lower part of the screen, there is like a little bubble there, and there, if you click on that, then you can share the link.
Okay, see everyone here, and then I see the little bubble. It says find someone to chat with.
No, just you.
Oh, here we go. I think I found it. All right. Do you see the link there?
Yes, yes.
So that's the link. That's a link to Ecologics, and it's a PDF. It's open access, so you can download the PDF there for free. It's the whole book.
I'm copying the link right now. So thank you so much, Cymene. This is a beautiful project. We really enjoyed it, and it enriched our understanding of Oaxaca and of all the debates about wind energy. Thank you so much, and we'll keep in touch.
Yes, thank you too. Thanks to everyone for coming out. It's great to have you here.